The period from 711 to 717 is often referred to as the period of the anarchy because this was a time which saw five different men hold the Byzantine throne. All of five of these men were very different from one another, and most of them were pretty interesting. And despite the fact that he was a bureaucrat by profession, Anastasius II is as interesting as any of them. So let's look at his reign now from 713 until 715. Since Anastasius II ruled in the middle of the Byzantine Dark Ages, it should come as no surprise that we know very little about him from a biographical perspective. We don't know when he was born, where he was born, or the names of any of his family members. What we do know is that his name was originally Artemius, and that he was an imperial secretary and bureaucrat who served under the Emperor Philippicus as a senior secretary. In 713, soldiers of the Ospician theme overthrew Philippicus and then elevated Artemius to take his place. And when he was elevated, Artemius took up the regnal name Anastasius, most likely in honor of the Emperor Anastasius I, who ruled from 491 to 518 and also originated in the bureaucracy. Perhaps the chief reason why both Roman and Byzantine soldiers typically installed their own generals as emperor when they chose to revolt is because they wanted a sure reward and they wanted to insulate themselves from punishment for what would otherwise be an act of treason. Because if you elevate someone who is unfriendly to you or someone who is a disciplinarian, then you always run the risk of being punished for your actions. Well, the soldiers of the Ospician theme had this experience when they elevated Anastasius II, who had no intentions of being their puppet. So as soon as he took power, Anastasius rounded up the soldiers and officers who were responsible for deposing and blinding Philippicus and had them executed. And this was supposed to send a strong message that he was going to enforce discipline and that he wouldn't play favorites. However, one of the key consequences of this action in the end is that this created lasting resentment toward Anastasius from the soldiers of the Ospician theme. So when he would turn to them later for their aid, this would prove to be a problem. The Emperor Philippicus had been a staunch monothelite, and he had more or less rammed his Christological views down the throat of the Eastern Church and the people of Constantinople, who seemed to have been majority Orthodox, so far as I can gather. Well, if you're Anastasius II, the next step forward is pretty clear. All Anastasius had to do was uphold the findings of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the same council that Philippicus had condemned, and the findings of this council, conveniently, condemned monothelitism as a heresy, which means that now Philippicus was officially a heretic again, and the seizure of power by Anastasius now had a justification in the minds of many of the people and elite figures of Constantinople. So this in itself lends him at least some small degree of legitimacy. One of Anastasius's other early acts was to depose Monothelite Patriarch John VI and install the Orthodox Germanus. Between these two actions, this was enough to end a short-lived schism with the papacy which had started under Philippicus. So, by ending that schism and setting the ship of the church back on the course that it had been, Anastasius was able to store up a great deal of credit in the capital. The early 8th century was a time of weakness and danger for the Byzantine Empire. At this time, they were under near constant attack from their strongest neighbor, the Umayyad Caliphate. And the reign of Anastasius II was no exception to this general trend. He faced attack by both land and sea during his short reign. Umayyad forces were able to penetrate as deep as Galatia in 714. Now, Anastasius tried to negotiate, but at the same time he knew that Constantinople was vulnerable to a naval assault due to the forward operating base at Rhodes, so he also renovated the city's walls in case of a siege. He got a reprieve when the Caliph al-Walid I died in 715, and then the initiative passed to the Byzantines on both land and sea as the Umayyads sought to install a new caliph and reestablish order. So during this time, Anastasius decides to launch a two-pronged counterattack. The first prong will be under a general named Leo the Isaurian, and he is dispatched to attack Syria over land. and then by sea, Anastasius wants to organize an attack on the naval stores at Rhodes, which would then remove the direct threat to the capital. Unfortunately, the men that he chose for this mission were the proud troops of the thematic army of Ospician. Unfortunately for the Emperor Anastasius II, his planned offensive would not come to fruition. The troops that he chose to attack Rhodes were none other than the men of the Ospician theme, and the Ospician troops were still pretty upset over Anastasius's perceived betrayal, so they decided, rather than to go on an expedition, which might be risky, to revolt. And they decided that they needed a new imperial candidate. And interestingly enough, rather than choose a general, which is again the norm for all revolting troops, these weird Ospician troops decide instead to find an obscure tax collector named Theodosius and to declare him the new emperor. So then these troops take the arms that they had stored for their campaign against Rhodes and they attack Constantinople. And after a 6-month siege, Anastasius II flees to Nicaea, but then at that point he has lost too much legitimacy and credibility by fleeing the capital, and he is arrested and forced to step down from the throne. Of all the emperors who were deposed by rivals, none was luckier than Anastasius II. When he officially submitted to and recognized the authority of Theodosius III in 716, he was allowed to retire peacefully to a monastery in Thessalonica. He was not mutilated, and he was not blinded. And without a doubt, the reasons are twofold. One is that Theodosius III was a fairly merciful guy, and two is that Theodosius could probably sympathize with the position of Anastasius, since both of them had been elevated, presumably against their respective wills, by the troops of the Ospician theme. And as Anastasius is in this monastery, he'll be there for 3 years. Theodosius III is in turn deposed by one of Anastasius's old generals, Leo the Isaurian, who had been sent to Syria, and Leo will boot Theodosius from the throne in 717. And Anastasius will remain in his monastery in Thessalonica up until 719, at which point he'll decide that the time is now ripe for a comeback. It's hard to really establish the motives of any emperor, especially someone who ruled during the Byzantine Dark Age. But in the case of Anastasius II, so far as I can tell, he was someone who really didn't want power in the first place, but then once he had it, he developed a taste for it, and he decided that ruling the Byzantine Empire was his destiny. So in 719, he left the monastery, and he decided to challenge Leo III the Isaurian for the throne. He received military aid from the Bulgars, who no doubt wanted to cause a little chaos in the Byzantine world, maybe gain a few territorial concessions from a victorious Anastasius, and he was also able to cobble together some other sources of support for his cause. Anastasius and his supporters marched on Constantinople, but Leo marched out to meet them, and Anastasius was defeated and executed. And this second attempt by Anastasius to reestablish himself as emperor is fairly indicative of the state of the times. This is still a time when there's a lot of fallout from the downfall of the Heraclean dynasty, which had ended with Justinian II, and it's going to be difficult for a new dynasty to really take root. Ultimately, Leo III will be able to build on his victory over Anastasius II and go on to found a successful dynasty, the Isaurian dynasty. But that was not clear in 719, and it looked like Leo was vulnerable, so that's exactly why Anastasius decided to strike when he did.